Hello, my name is Julia Korkman. I work as a senior program specialist at HEUNI, and I have a long background in research related to investigative interviewing and to memory within the criminal investigation context. And I have also been working with criminal investigations in practice, particularly interviewing young victims and witnesses of crimes. Furthermore, I'm also the president of the European Association of Psychology and Law, which is a scientific network of researchers in the area. And at HEUNI, I have been working largely with trafficking issues and in particular investigative interviewing in the context of human trafficking. I will now give an overview of memory, what we know about memory, and in particular in the context of investigative interviewing and criminal investigations. And when we talk about memory, psychologists usually divide memory into different types of memory. So we have procedural memory for motoric activities such as driving a car. Many of these become completely automated. And we have semantic memory, which refers to what we know, facts, things we learn in school, for instance. And then we have, which is perhaps the most important from the investigative context, autobiographical memory, which is, or it's also called episodic memory, but it's the memory of our personally experienced events, things that have happened to us. And this is, of course, something that the kind of memory we are looking for in the investigative context. There's also certainly, for example, sensorical memory, which refers to senses. A smell can bring back a situation we have been in or raise a certain emotion in us, and sometimes also without us understanding from where this feeling has come, for instance. This, again, can be seen in traumatized people. They may sometimes react very strongly to sounds or smells or other sensoric inputs without really even realizing where that strong emotion comes from. But it may be associated to some event that has been traumatizing for them. When we talk about episodic memory, the memories we have of our experiences, as I said, this is really what we deal with in criminal investigations, in court cases where witnesses are asked to tell about their experiences and where these accounts are then assessed for reliability. And we know that some of the measures or indicators used to assess people's accounts are not really in line with how human memory actually works. There seems to be a kind of overly optimistic perception that memory would be something similar to a video recorder, which would sort of record what we experience and that we would be able to put the play button even several years after our experience and tell the experience the way we did experience it many years ago. For example, in Finland, court proceedings can last several years, and yet we rely on witnesses to show up in court and tell about their experiences, sometimes many, many years earlier. And their accounts are also assessed by looking at discrepancies, for instance, or how many details they remember. And this is in itself inherently problematic. And I will come back to that. So this is one typical misconception about memory, that it would work like a video recorder. And this certainly is very far from the truth. Another misconception that can be found in particular in crimes where, for instance, crimes within close relationships, intimate partnership violence, where violence is reoccurring, or in human trafficking situations where, for example, sexual violence or labor exploitation situations are reoccurring in a similar way time after time after time. These are like long processes rather than a few very clearly separated events. So one problem with these kind of repeated events in the eyes of the criminal justice system is that there seems to be an expectation that repeated events would be better remembered later on than individual events that take place only once. This is probably due to the fact that we all have experience of the fact that when we rehearse something many times, we remember it better. It sort of strengthens the memory. And while this is true for things we learn, when we experience situations that are highly similar to one another, this actually almost makes the memory strength slightly less exact. So paradoxically, unique experiences are often better distinguished in memory than these frequently occurring similar events. What we do with these frequently occurring similar events is that we create scripts of how they usually happen. So if you think of all the birthdays or Christmases or name any other kind of repetitive event that you've experienced in your life, we are highly unlikely to remember each and every one of these in a clear way. We do remember how they usually happened. We do also often remember the most recent one. For example, last Christmas is far easier to recall immediately than Christmas 7 or 12 years ago. And we also tend to recall those instances that are particularly special. So, for example, if you have experienced one Christmas in which something dramatic happened, someone was born or someone died, or you spent that Christmas in the Caribbean and it was very different from all other Christmases, this is much more likely to be remembered in a unique way than all the other Christmases that turn into this sort of generic Christmas script. And this is, as I said, this can be highly relevant in intimate partner violence cases or cases of trafficking. And it has been found that you can certainly help witnesses and victims remember quite a lot of detail also from repeated events, but you have to go about this remembering in a slightly different way. And often you have to allow witnesses, victims to be interviewed several times because there tends to be more information to be recalled in the investigative interviews. When we look at memory, it's, as I said, it's not pushing a button and going back to a situation as it was, but it's more a process. And to understand really memory in the investigative interview, we have to understand how we remember, why we remember what we remember, and how we best can retrieve memory traces. So memory is more like a process which starts with encoding. You experience a situation often with a lot of sensoric inputs, a lot of things going on, and our human mind is what would I say? It's limited in how much it can take in. So we cannot focus our attention on everything at the same time, and it wouldn't be useful for us to do that. We need to focus our attention on what we esteem to be the most significant thing at the moment. This means also that we shut out a lot of other information. And what we do not focus on, we obviously cannot concentrate, we cannot remember later. What we pay attention to, again, is related to what we find interesting or important. Nowadays, I think the police has issues with witnesses looking only at their own phones, in spite of the fact that they are surrounded by important events. But this is how the human attention works. Then of what we pay attention to, only a small part is really stored in memory for a longer time. So most of the things we learn and see and experience every day, we forget immediately or very soon. Also, this is how it should be. Our brains could not handle it if we remembered everything we see and hear and experience. And again, this is what we remember is largely dictated but by what is important to us, what is emotionally relevant, what we know we will need, what sort of touches upon something that is of relevance in our lives. Of course, sometimes we do remember irritating information that we have no use of, but so there are these strange exceptions to this rule. These, both what we perceive and what we then have in our memory, what we keep in our memory, these memory traces and these perceptions, they can be distorted already at the time of paying attention to something. We can get a false understanding of what is going on, and also what we remember can by time be distorted. The last part of the memory process is retrieval. So how we are able to sort of look up information from our memory and how we are able to communicate that. And here we are very much dependent on who we are talking to. And this is, of course, where the interviewer comes in if we talk about a criminal investigation. whereas the criminal justice system cannot affect in what state a witness was, for instance, when observing a criminal incident, and they cannot affect how much information this particular witness has forgotten. They can affect how this witness is interviewed, how they are heard. And this is really where we need to put quite a lot of emphasis. We can, even though we cannot affect how witnesses felt, or if they were in a state of shock, or if they were drunk when they experienced something, we can, of course, collect information about that and see if that would affect our assessment of the witness memory, and this can be of relevance. But it's important to understand this process of memory and the fact that distortions can take place at any moment. In this picture, you can see a ladder. It was part of an art exhibition that I visited some years ago, and it was an exhibition where the photographer had taken pictures to symbolize his sister's suicide. There were pictures with places relevant for the sister, and this ladder you can see in the middle of the picture sort of symbolized her absence. As you understand, this was a quite emotional exhibition, and I wandered around this little room and left it. And then when I came back, I was surprised to find that the ladder was in the middle of the room, because I had not paid attention to it. And it made me smile, because this is, I think, a very common phenomenon in a criminal court, in a courtroom where a criminal case is handled. You may have witnesses who have been at the crime scene or where something very relevant has happened, and they may simply not have seen it or paid attention to it. In this case, of course, in some way, I had been aware of the ladder, because I had successfully managed to walk around it. I wasn't bumping into it or anything, but I would never have been able to recall it, because my attention was on the pictures on the wall, and it was also very emotional. So my focus was very strongly on these pictures. And this is something we know from research, that if something is emotionally relevant, and in particular if it's sort of traumatizing, we tend to pay even more attention to the really central details on the expense of then surrounding things. This may lead, in the case of traumatized victims, to memories that seem a bit skeletal or that lack a lot of other detail. And sometimes, unfortunately, the lack of detail can be seen as an indication that the victim is not telling the truth, or that they cannot be found reliable. We also know that when we see something, especially if we see situations that are very quickly evolving, we tend to draw conclusions that are not only based on what we see, but also on our prejudices, on our previous experiences, on our emotional state even. So our brain sort of serves us what it finds to be the most plausible explanation for what we are observing. It happens automatically and in a way that we are largely unaware of. This is an example at Manhattan in New York some years back, where 2 police officers shot down a man in the middle of a sunny street, as you can see. The man was black, and 2 witnesses, independent of each other, saw the situation and claimed that the police had hunted down the man and shot him in the street. One of them even said that she saw the police handcuffing the man and then shooting him. In reality, this was not at all what happened, and we know this because there was a video recording in place in this street for the traffic. So it could be verified later on that actually what had taken place was that this man, who was called David Beryl, he was actually chasing the female police officer you see lying in the street, and he was just about to hit her in her head with a hammer when the other police shot him down. He didn't die of this shot. And of course, the interesting thing is here, how come these 2 witnesses who were by no means related to any of these people, had no personal stake in this case, how could both of them independently of each other make the observation that the police just chased this man and shot him down, even if the opposite was true? And what many colleagues, many psychologists who were then asked to talk with media about this assessed was that this is probably due to our scripts once again. In the US, there have been, for very good reasons, quite a lot of critical discussion about how the police treat black suspects, and that they quickly jump to conclusions and quickly shoot. And this is a true problem. But this is also what people would expect then to happen in a situation where they don't really have the time to make good observations. So their sort of brains fill in what they find is the most plausible explanation. But here we can see one of the risks with how testimonies work in these very quickly evolving situations. I already mentioned that lengthy criminal justice processes in themselves actually are a risk, because our memory works so that we forget most of what we experience and see quite quickly. This has been known since 1885, when German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus started doing some tests on how quickly he forgets things he has just learned. And although this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve that you can see on the picture has quite a few years already behind them, we know that this is there have been many newer studies showing a very similar pattern. So most things we forget quite rapidly, but the things that stay after a few months are more likely then to stay on further as well. And you also know that things that we have had in our mind, in our memory for a long, long time, they can get like quite well cemented, if you want to use that expression. We know, for example, from old people with dementia or who are already who struggle to remember recently occurred issues that they can often remember very long ago, things that have happened very long ago. And this is probably due to the fact that these have already sort of been quite cemented. What we remember then is related to what we find relevant. This is affected by culture, by how we grow up, by what is important in our family to remember. And we also know that things that are highly emotional, that are related, for example, to danger and fear, risk for life, those we are inclined to remember much better. This probably has to do with a sort of necessity to stay alive. So if something has been very dangerous to us, it sort of has probably served human beings for their survival to remember these things very well. Another thing that we know about memory is that we human beings are very suggestible. This has been known for more than 100 years. Many scholars in Europe and the US talked about this already during at the end of the 2 centuries ago, so at the end of the 1900th century. For example, Alfred Binet wrote a book called La Suggestibilité, Suggestibility, in 1900, where he, among other things, warned that if children or other vulnerable persons are being posed very leading or suggestive questions, they might take in the information from the question and sort of create, or they might have false memories. Their memories can be hampered by it. And this we know from today from quite a lot of research. So suggestion and suggestibility, these are really, really important concepts in investigative interviewing, because this can take place also in the investigative interview. And in this context, you could say that suggestion can both be a tendency to incorporate elements that have not been experienced into a memory. So the memory gets distorted by false new information. But it can also be a more social process, so that the interviewee says what they think the interviewer wants to hear. And here we know that children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable, but also people who have, for example, mental health issues can be highly suggestible. And also in any interview which is consisting of very suggestive elements, human beings in general can be prone to really going along because of the high social pressure. And suggestion, also in an investigative interviewer context, can really lead to completely false accounts. This has been shown in, as I said, lots of research, and one of the original, quite known studies was one conducted by Loftus and Palmer already in the 70s, where they showed a video of 2 cars crashing to a big number of people, and then they asked all the participants to assess how fast the cars were driving when they crashed. But they phrased the question a little differently. They divided the group into 5 subgroups and phrased this same question a little differently for every group, just varying one word. As you can see here, they asked, About how fast were the cars going when they smashed or collided or bumped or hit or contacted each other. So it went from like a crash to something just a small touch. And interestingly enough, the respondents assessed the speed of the cars very much in relation to how strong the expressed crash or hit or bump was. So those who were asked how fast they were going when they smashed assessed that the speed had been much higher than those who were asked when they contacted each other. A week later, all the participants were asked if they had seen broken glass at the scene of the crash. And those, again, who had been asked about a smash were much more likely to report that they had seen broken glass. There was no broken glass, but in their memory, they had already observed a quite forceful smash. This has also been seen in real criminal cases. For instance, in the Swedish case where Minister Anna Lindh was stabbed to death at a warehouse in central Stockholm, at the department store in central Stockholm, there were 29 persons who saw the man who later was to be convicted of the stabbing. He though had time to, or he escaped before the police was there, so he was not arrested in place. So the police did not have the suspect at the time, and they of course wanted as good descriptions of him as possible in order to be able to find him. So they asked, there were, as I said, 29 persons present. They asked all of them to wait in a room so that they would be able to interview them. The problem was that apparently they did not instruct the witnesses to be quiet. And of course, what people do if they observe something strange or indeed frightening, dramatic, and they are being asked to wait together is, of course, that they communicate, they talk about what they saw. And this had the very serious consequence in this case that the woman who was standing closest, she had the best possibilities to observe this perpetrator. She claimed that he had a camouflage patterned jacket, which he did not. At the picture you can see the guy, he has a gray jumper. And interestingly enough, several other witnesses also claimed that they had seen a man in a camouflage pattern jacket. And this implies that they had, completely unawarely of it, they had taken in this one witness description in their own memories and sort of replaced probably a lack of memory with a precise description. That, however, was not based on their own observations, but on that of another person. There is also quite a lot of research showing that not only can our memories be distorted, but it is quite possible for people to actually create completely false memories. So memories of things that have never happened. And it is surprisingly easy to make people, for example, remember things from their childhood that has not occurred. It seems to be enough in studies to say that we know from your parents that you experienced getting lost in a mall or doing something stupid at a wedding party or other types of events that are sort of not completely implausible, but that have been checked that they have never occurred to this person. But if people get from a reliable source that this is what has happened to you, they are quite prone to starting to invent what it must have happened. And this can actually lead to something that really feels like a true memory and that is quite indistinguishable from real memories or memories of actually occurred events. In the picture you see here, this type of study was conducted using photographs. So you had 3 real photographs from the participants' childhood. So we have like a group of participants who are participating in our research. We have pictures of them when they were children, and 3 true pictures, and then the 4th one is one that we hamper with. So we cut out. In this picture, you can see this participant when he was a young boy together with his father. They are cut out from the original picture and moved into a hot air balloon. And researchers have already established with the parents of this participant that he never, as a child, went for a hot air balloon ride. But when these pictures are being shown to him one after the other, he recalls likely the other events and is surprised to find this picture because he has no memory of it. But about 1/3 or 1/4 of participants quite quickly start sort of remembering what happened. So they start sort of explaining to themselves what must have happened. This must have been when we were in Australia when I was a child, and mother took the picture because she's afraid of heights. So there is clear indications that unfortunately people are suggestible to the extent that we can actually plant false memories in their minds. And of course this can be severely misused also in criminal contexts by perpetrators. But the other side of it is that investigative interviewers, or indeed also support services, have to be very careful when discussing past events with, in particular, with vulnerable victims, so as not to implant things that they might not have experienced by complete mistake. To sum up, I would say that memory is like a snowy landscape. This is familiar for us here in Finland. As soon as someone walks on the landscape, there will be traces, and there's no way of going back exactly to the landscape how it was. And this landscape can really be changed every time the event is being discussed and being actively recalled. So I think interviewers really need to thread carefully not to hamper this landscape.